So this is the simplified version of this greet function we created earlier. Now, in programming, we have two types of functions. Functions that perform a task and functions that calculate and return a value. Here are some examples. Both the print and greet functions are examples of type 1. They're performing a task, which is printing something on the terminal. In contrast, the round function is an example of a function that calculates and returns a value. So the functions that you create fall into these two categories. Now let me show you how to rewrite this greet function, but in the second form. So instead of printing this string on the terminal, we simply return it. Let me show you. So I'm going to delete all this code, define a new function, but call it get_greeting. We add the name parameter and simply return this formatted string hi name. That's all we have to do. So we use the return statement to return a value from this function. Now we can call this function get_greeting, pass a name like Mosh. Because it returns a value, we can store that value in a separate variable like message. Now you might be curious, which form of these greeting functions is better? Well, with this first implementation, we are locked to printing something in the terminal. In the future, if we want to write that message in a file or send it in an email, we have to create another function. So we cannot reuse this greet function in other scenarios. In contrast, this second form is not tied to printing something on the terminal. It simply returns a value. Now we get this value and we can do whatever we want with it. We can print it on the terminal, or we can use the built-in open function to write this message to a file. So we can create a file like content.txt, open it for writing. This returns a file object, and then we can call file.write_message. Now don't worry about these two lines. Later in the course, I'm going to talk about working with files. But what I want you to take away here is that we have this message variable and we can do whatever we want with it. We can print it on the terminal, write it to a file, send it in an email, and so on. And one more thing before we finish this lecture. So here's our greet function, and as you can see, we're simply printing a string. Now, if we call greet, give it a name, run the program, we get this message, hi Mosh. But what if we put this inside of a call to the print function? Let's see what we get. We get hi Mosh, followed by none. What is this? None is the return value of the greet function. So in Python, all functions by default return the none value. None is an object that represents the absence of a value. Later in the course, you're going to learn more about none. What matters now is that all functions return none by default unless you specifically return a value. So here, if we return some string, none will no longer be returned. Now, I just want to clarify something. Earlier, I told you that we have two types of functions in programming, functions that carry out a task or functions that calculate and return a value. So back to the code we previously had. So even though this function returns none by default, it is still classified as a function that carries out a task.